Charlotte Wells, 3.3, Stress, Anxiety and Arousal. In situation 1, we'll be looking at Nick, who plays badminton for Basvik and has been struggling with anxiety inside and outside of his sport. Nick is experiencing anxiety while playing sport and outside of badminton, meaning that it is affecting his everyday behaviours. Anxiety itself was defined by Buckwork and Dishman 2002 as a negative state of worry, apprehension or tension that often occurs in the absence of real or obvious danger. Typically, the tension felt by anxious individuals is accompanied by a heightened state of physiological arousal. This shows that anxiety is always a negative emotional state that is often associated with increased levels of arousal. People who experience anxiety experience feelings of apprehension with fears, doubts, and worries. Anxiety is caused by situations that are threatening because we doubt our own ability to succeed or cope. Nick is clearly made anxious by many things that he perceives to be threatening. We can identify that Nick is not just experiencing stress, because stress is a reaction to a current demand, whereas anxiety is a reaction to something that could happen in the future, which often leads to over-arousal. Nick is clearly suffering from trait anxiety, which is a personality disposition that is stable over time. It is an inbuilt proneness to worry. Those with high levels of trait anxiety are likely to become worried in a variety or all situations. Those with trait anxiety often overreact and become highly aroused quickly. They feel threatened, and in a response to this, they experience high levels of state anxiety. Nick is anxious outside of his sport and worries about his grades and homework, showing that this trait anxiety, which is predisposed. Trait theory defines personality in terms of identifiable patterns of behaviour. It describes traits instead of explaining them, which is different to other theories. A trait is a stable characteristic, meaning that an individual constantly behaves in these ways, explaining Nick's worries. If Nick only worried within his sport, this would not be considered a trait anxiety of his. It is evident that Nick also suffers with cognitive anxiety, which is the thought component of anxiety. It is mainly associated with worry and being fearful of negative evaluations within performances. McNally 2002 described it as the negative expectations and concerns about one's ability to perform and the possible consequences of failure. It is seen as the amount a person worries in their mind, where they experience feelings such as negative thoughts, apprehension, and the inability to concentrate. This cognitive anxiety is brought on by stress, which will be caused by pressure caused during Nick's badminton matches. High levels of cognitive anxiety can lead to lower performance levels, which is a negative effect. During Nick's badminton games, his coach is trying to reassure him. However, his own levels of worry stop him from being able to perform well. This will be brought on by the stress of the match. If this becomes too overwhelming for Nick, then his performance levels will decrease, and he will likely lose the match he's playing. Nick's cognitive anxiety will increase more leading up to competition, and then remain high. This will build a few days or weeks before, not just prior to the start of competition. It will fluctuate during the competition, depending on the success or failure that he faces. Another type of anxiety that Nick appears to be suffering with is somatic anxiety. This is the physical component of anxiety associated with things like increased heart rate and blood pressure. It has the same symptoms of arousal, but it is triggered by cognitive anxiety. Somatic state anxiety relates to the person's perception of the physiological changes that happen to their body in a situation. There are many types of physiological changes that can happen, such as increased muscle tension, clammy hands, feeling sick, and higher breathing rate. The anxiety and worry is based off of these physiological changes. Nick has described feeling nauseous before his games, which will cause his anxiety to climb much higher as he'll be thinking about how sick he feels. He probably also experiences symptoms such as clammy hands and a faster heart rate. His somatic anxiety will remain lower until a dramatic rise a few hours before an event. As he becomes more comfortable during the game, it should decrease. All players that take part in sports will feel psychological changes just before they start playing. Different people experience different factors that affect their anxiety. For Nick, personal factors like trait anxiety, his self-esteem, and maybe even social physique anxiety will affect how he is feeling. There can be other stresses that play into his state anxiety, like stress about his schoolwork. There will also be situational factors that play into Nick's anxiety, such as the importance of the situation he is in and how uncertain he is. His anxiety will be at its worst when he is playing an important match against a well-experienced good player. The pressure will be on him, and it will more likely negatively affect Nick's play. Research has shown that some individuals can tolerate a wide range of anxiety intensities before experiencing a decline in performance, whereas others perform best only when the anxiety lies within a very narrow range. Han 2000. For Nick, his intensity is a very narrow range, seeing as he experiences lots of anxieties which prevent him from performing well. His range isn't as big as more professional athletes. Of all the psychological factors thought to influence sport performance, anxiety is often considered the most important, said Han 2000. It is clear that for Nick, anxiety is very important and can make or break his performance. Nick also experiences different levels of arousal during his gameplay. Arousal is a general physiological and psychological activation, varying on a continuum from deep sleep to intense excitement. Weinberg and Gould, 2007, the psychologists also found that arousal is the blend of physiological and psychological activity in a person, and it refers to the level of motivation, alertness, and excitement at a particular moment. It's a level of readiness to perform that is usually linked to motivation or drive, and it prepares the body for action. Physiological arousal refers to features of arousal reflected by physiological reactions, such as escalations in blood pressure and rate of respiration, and lessened activity of the gastrointestinal system. The function of the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic nervous system, and parasympathetic nervous system are all linked to the central nervous system, as we have evolved this because of our fight or flight response. During an emergency situation, the brain registers a problem and then sends a message down to the nervous system. The central nervous system is attached to our muscles, which have ATP ready to respond. The hypothalamus in the brain sends a signal to the adrenal gland. This gives adrenaline to the circulatory system, which will move through the body. As the heart beats faster, epinephrine will flow throughout the rest of the body. This epinephrine binds to the protein on the surface of the muscle. In the liver, it triggers a signal transduction pathway that converts glycogen to glucose, which is our supply of energy. Epinephrine also goes to the lungs, which speeds up your breathing. The heart, which speeds up your heart rate. The digestive system, which slows down digestion, as it is an unneeded process, and to the muscles, which causes glycogen breakdown. The reticular activating system regulates levels of arousal and monitors levels of stimulation. Different sports require different levels of arousal. Some sports need low levels of arousal if they are more focused, whereas sports that need high levels of arousal are more about being assertive. Examples of low-level arousal sports are golf, gymnastics, and archery, as these require high levels of precision. For example, a putt in golf or a backflip with twist in gymnastics. Sports that need high levels of arousal include rugby, boxing, and football, as there is less precision needed. Tackling in rugby or weightlifting requires determination and not much thought process. At the 2012 Olympic Games, Greg Rutherford failed one of his attempts at the long jump as he ran through the sand. This could be due to levels of arousal being too high, so he had less control over himself, and therefore he performed worse. Different athletes have different levels of optimal arousal. For example, someone like Nick would have a lower optimal level of arousal because otherwise he will become too stressed and perform negatively. In the graph on the slide, you can see that there is an inverted U-shaped graph showing that the lower somebody's arousal levels are, the higher their performance levels are. But if their arousal are too high, then their performance levels are also low. The best type of arousal level is somewhere in between, as it leaves you with a better performance and you're excited but you aren't bored nor anxious. If arousal levels become too high, then you or the player becomes stressed. Somatic anxiety and cognitive anxiety make up a person's level of arousal. Somatic anxiety is physiological and cognitive is mental. This makes up both of the Somatic anxiety is physiological and cognitive is mental. This makes up both the physiological and the psychological readiness for a sport. Nick's performance is described as falling apart if he misses a shot. This links in with a certain arousal theory known as catastrophe theory. This theory is developed on from the inverted U theory. Fazey and Hardy, 1988, noted that performance does not always gradually deteriorate as arousal increases, as shown in the inverted U theory. When cognitive anxiety is low and somatic anxiety is high, then performance follows this perfect inverted U shape. However, when cognitive and somatic anxiety are both high, then performance follows this inverted U to a point until there can be a dramatic decline, otherwise known as a catastrophe, within the performance. If a catastrophe does occur, small reductions in arousal will not bring the performance back to its previous level. The performer must completely relax in order to bring their arousal below the point at which the catastrophe occurred. When Nick makes an error and his performance falls apart, then he will struggle to bring his performance levels back up to where they need to be. This can be detrimental to performance. If Nick can't bring his game back, then he has potentially lost a whole match through one or two sloppy errors. Nidifer, 1976, argues that increased arousal levels could cause changes in attention and concentration. High levels of arousal can occur when athletes have too much information to attend to at one time. For example, if Nick is worrying too much about his grades as well as his performance and what shot he should be taking, then his brain will become overwhelmed with too much information. It can cause the athlete to attend to the wrong cue. In a different game, such as netball, a centre player could have the ball and be looking for a player to throw it to. If her teammates behind her is shouting for her attention, but a different teammate is in front with more space, her brain will be too overwhelmed to take into consideration what is going on, and she will just revert back to her natural instincts and throw it to the people shouting at her, due to the pressure she is put under. This can potentially lose matches due to throwing to the wrong people and not working as should. It can have major effects on performances. Narrowing the athlete's attentional field means that they are unable to take in all external factors. This happens when arousal levels are too high. If the athlete's level of arousals are too low, however, then their attention field will be too broad. They will be feeling bored and won't be able to concentrate on the game they're playing due to a wandering mind. It causes a player to scan the field less often and they are less aware of their situation. Ideally, players reach their optimal attention field, which is moderate levels of arousal, where they can process as much information as needed and play to their peak performance. In an evaluation, positives about the catastrophe theory state the research is supportive of this relationship. However, it has been criticised that testing is difficult and stops us from being able to predict athletes' performances. That being said, if Nick is known to deteriorate after an error, then coaches can look to spy these errors and help Nick to develop his ability to cope with them. Stress can be positive or negative. It can have beneficial effects in terms of mobilization of bodily resources to meet demands, but also detrimental effects when perceived demands exceed the individual's resource. McHugh in 2002. Nick will be experiencing distress, which is an extreme form of anxiety, nervousness, apprehension, or worry, as a result of perceived inability to meet demands. Symptoms of this stress will include moodiness, talking quickly, unable to relax, reduced concentration and loss of esteem. The causes of these stress could be to do with significant people like family. It could also be to do with the pressure of competition. It could be in relation to sponsors that the athlete may need to impress, or it could just be due to lack of sleep or injuries. In Nick's case, we can put this down to his cause of stress, to the sporting environment or his occupation. McGrath 1970 came up with a stress process. A demand will be required and will be needed if a positive perception is taken, and it is seen as a challenge to the person will